The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello, everybody. We're going to get started in about 1 minute. A lot of folks are still coming online. If you would do me a favor, and if you can hear me fine and dandy, can you let me know? And you can let me know by going into the chat section and just say, hey, we can hear you, or just raise your hand as well. And then I know. Okay, thanks, Judy and Kat and Rebecca. Yay, yay, yay. Oh, look at you guys. Okay, awesome. All right. And notice that there's 3 handouts in the handout section. And at the end of the broadcast, I will be happy to take any questions that you might have. If you have questions along the way, just go ahead and put them in the chat area. And as we are going through the webinar, if I can answer them while we are progressing through the material, I would be happy to do that. Okay. And let me make sure that you can see my screen. So everybody should be able to see my screen. So if you can give me a shout out. This is what happens when you do webinar solo. I'm not quite sure what's happening on the other end. So you guys letting me know that would be awesome. Okay, great. I can see that everybody hears me. Hold on one second. I got one. I want to pull up my chat area so I can see that. So rearranging things. Hope everybody's having a great summer and that you're actually doing something for fun. I had the luxury of being off the road for the last 7 days because of the 4th of July holiday. But getting back on the road, I know a lot of teachers in Arizona are getting ready to start again, start up the school year. Okay, so I want to be respectful of everybody's time. It's 6:01 and we're going to get started. I just want to welcome everybody. My name's Katie McKnight. I'm the CEO and founder of Engaging Learners, where we work to engage all students in reading and writing for the 21st century. And tonight's webinar, our summer webinar series, which is my way of giving back to my community, is focused on learning targets and proficiency scales and taking those first initial baby steps towards standards and skills-based grading. And obviously, it is a huge topic. So this is really an overview and to get you started, and also offering a lot of suggestions, additional materials, and resources that you can use to get started. And I see my buddy Naomi's there. Yay, Naomi. She's been writing some proficiency scales. We've been working on a project together. So how many of you have been already using proficiency scales in your schools? And just put your hand up. Give me an idea. Okay. Yeah, a bunch of you. Yeah. Okay. Good. All right. So, and most of you are eager to learn more, I'm sure. Okay. So let's get started. And just want to remind you too that with Engaging Learners, my team and we serve schools in the United States and internationally. And to really make sure that we develop skills, focusing on literacy skills to develop literacy skills in all students. And I do want to emphasize all, whether students are academically achieving and also our students who might be struggling or below level. And our children with special needs. And we provide customized professional development, professional learning, and literacy development, standards and skills-based assessment. We also do a lot of grant writing, help schools to figure out how to get funding, because we know that there's never enough funding for our schools with grant writing. And then we also do professional coaching as well, and really developing those professional resources to develop literacy skills. And you can stay in touch with us on our newsletter if you go to my website at engaginglearners.com, or actually catherinemcknight.com. We're actually merging those sites this summer. We're working on a new website, which is going to be pretty exciting. And that's going to be launched sometime in August, just before Labor Day. So we'll keep you posted on that. And you can, of course, you can always call us at that number. And also you can reach me personally on email at katiengagelearners@gmail.com. And I do answer emails, just to be very clear on that. And after our last webinar, a lot of folks had some questions and asked about additional resources. And I'm happy to return any email that I receive, and I make sure that I do. Okay, so, and I want to give a special shout out to my Instagram followers. I feel so hip and happening. I'm finally on Instagram in about the last month and getting quite a following over there. So those of you who are on Instagram, hello. And you probably have seen me hanging out on Instagram quite a bit lately. So I just wanted to give you guys a special shout out. Okay, so we're going to talk about learning targets. There's a lot of vocabulary. So the first thing that we're going to do is really focus in on the definitions and the definitions that we're going to use. So we all have a common definition. So I'm always amazed when we talk about things like differentiated instruction or intervention, that depending on the state or the district that I'm in, that can take on different meanings. So, and I also want to apologize too. I've got a great summer cold going, so I sound a little bit more nasally than I usually do with that Chicago accent. So, if I cough every once in a while, I'm really sorry about that. The joys of hanging out in schools, right? Lots of germs. Anyway, so we're going to talk about learning targets. What exactly are learning targets? And before I do that, I want to remind everybody that, of course, all of this work is rooted in formative assessment. And I've done webinars before on the ABCs of formative assessment, and I'll be offering that webinar again this fall. But formative assessment is based on the work of Margaret Heritage and James Popham. And the idea of that, we assess kids as we go along. So having large multiple choice kinds of tests or benchmark assessments, can those be used as formative assessment? Yes, absolutely. But all assessment, let's be very clear on this, all assessment needs to be reliable, varied, and I'm going to emphasize varied, and fair. So we need to triangulate assessment, use different kinds of instruments, because not all kids do well, for instance, on a standard kind of multiple choice test or quiz. So we want to make sure that we have varied assessment. But formative assessment is never ever formative assessment unless that data is used to change instruction. So a lot of times I'll see in schools and districts that there are benchmark assessments along the way or common formative assessments, but there isn't a plan of action to actually adjust instruction based on the information that we receive. And notice that I'm saying information rather than data, because data is not always, information is not always in the form of numbers, right? Actually, formative assessment, one of the tenets of formative assessment is the idea of descriptive feedback and giving kids descriptive feedback. And descriptive feedback is never in the form of a letter grade or a number, because those can be highly subjective. But they're very concrete things on where you're meeting a particular learning target and what you need to do to improve in order to meet that learning target. So before we even talk about proficiency scales, we need to talk about learning targets. And remember, all of this is rooted in formative assessment. Okay, so here we go with the learning targets, all right? And learning targets basically are this in a nutshell. Their learning targets are short-term goals or statements. And a lot of us who are using standards and such in our states, whether it's Common Core or specific state-based standards like in Texas or Indiana or Florida, well, I have to say, looking at all the state standards, that they all pretty much are following the same thing as far as a focus on skills, and the skills are articulated within those standards, which is a paradigm shift. So we're looking at skills, and the content is the vehicle to develop skills. And I also want to be very clear too, is that I get a little bristly about using the term standards-based assessment. So if you notice, the title for this webinar was skills/standards-based assessment, because it's not the standards, it's really the skills. It's the skills that we're developing, and they are articulated in the standards. So I don't want to lose sight of the fact that we're developing skills and content knowledge. That's really what we're getting at. And when we're quote unquote meeting standards, what we're really doing is developing those skills that are articulated in the standards. So that's just me being kind of picky, but I get bristly on that because I feel like we might lose sight of things. Anyway, but your learning targets should clearly state what you expect of your kiddos, what you expect of your students, what you expect them to know and be able to do at the end of the lesson. Now, back in the day, those of us who have been teaching for several decades, we used to call those learning objectives, and they're not all that different from what we're calling now learning targets. And sometimes they're in kid-friendly language, so you'll hear like "I can" statements, or the student will be able to, or I am able to, or we can. And those are kind of examples of that. So our learning target for this 1 hour webinar or 45-minute webinar is that I'm hoping, this is what I hope you're going to be able to do, is that you'll be able to, that webinar participants will learn to clearly identify learning goals, articulated in some sample standards, and recognize how goals and targets are integrated into proficiency scales. So you start getting some understanding of that as we go through. So here's some of the instructional benefits that we know about using learner targets. And when we focus on learner targets and we focus on the skills and about mastery of skills, there's a lot of magic that starts happening. And because what we know from work from like Alfie Cohen and others, his seminal work of Punished by Rewards, is that if we tend to use letter grades and number grades, what it creates is a fixed mindset, which is what Carol Dweck talks about, that, I can't get to a higher level, I can't move on. And children of poverty, in particular, as Alfie Kohn notes, and Eric Jensen has done some work on this too in his book, Teaching with Poverty in Mind, Teaching Students with Poverty in Mind, is that both of them find that when we give out letter grades and number grades, that it creates a deficit mindset. It creates a fixed mindset, and that it's a self-fulfilling prophecy. And children of poverty are particularly susceptible to it. So instead, if we say, hey, here's where you are and here's where you can be, that's creates a growth mindset and for lack of a better term, an I can kind of feeling about things. So here's some instructional benefits, some additional ones, is that we also have greater clarity about assessments. Kids really understand what they need to do in order to be successful. And when I used to teach at the university level, I would kind of say this jokingly because we had to give out letter grades, is I would say, okay, here's what you need to do to get an A. This is how you get an A in the class. And being very clear and quite articulate about it. It shouldn't be a secret. And then knowing what to assess with greater precision. So my background, of course, is literacy. And in a balanced literacy framework, one of the things that I always mention when we're building proficiency scales in a balanced literacy framework is that if you're truly teaching and developing literacy skills within a balanced literacy framework, you're going to be teaching pretty much all of those standards very often, and they interweave and kind of do an orchestrated ballet, a dance. However, there are points within the school year, points along the instructional roadway where I'm going to assess specific skills. So, for example, I might have on my proficiency scale in quarter 1 a reading standard that I'm sure all of us know of I can identify main ideas or a theme and related details that develop that theme or main idea. That's a pretty common sort of standard. Okay, just because I assess that in quarter 1 doesn't mean that we're not doing it for the rest of the year. Of course, we're doing it for the rest of the year. So when we get to that second one where it says know what to assess with greater precision, it's next to impossible to assess 60 skills at once. So what are we zeroing in on a given amount of time? And it doesn't mean that we aren't teaching other things. It just means that we're assessing at that given point of time. And I saw a lot of that when Common Core first came out, is that folks would have on instructional plans and such, they'd have gobs and gobs and gobs and gobs of standards, like 20, 30 standards listed. And I said, how are you going to assess all these? There's no way you can. So it's just where our focus is, okay? And then focused instructional practice. So if I'm going to be assessing on something, I want to make sure that I have greater emphasis on it, that I'm not overlooking something, because as educators, we have a lot of ground that we have to cover in a given school year as far as skill development and content development. So it helps us to get more focused. So for instance, if I'm teaching a specific skill, like figurative language and the difference between simile, metaphor, personification. And I find out in my second quarter assessment that my students have it down. They've got it. Then I might omit it later on, or not omit it, but not teach it as directly as I may have in quarter three or quarter four. So it also helps us to really maximize our instructional time. And then conversely, when we see that there's an area that the kids haven't fully developed yet, that we can go back, of course, and shore that up. All right. And then more skilled at using assessment. That's the other thing, too. I would say that if you're using proficiency scales and you're doing collaborative learning and we're doing centers based instruction, guess what? You shouldn't be taking a ton of papers home to grade, because if you're using those proficiency scales and giving that descriptive feedback on the spot, which is more effective anyway, then we're just going to be more skilled at it. We're much more precise about things. We know what we're going to be zeroing in on it. And I've got a couple of case studies too, in my experience in schools where we went into proficiency scales and how that really changed instruction and student performance. So here are the benefits to learners is that our students develop greater understanding of expectations and criteria of success. So I always say there should be no surprises. When the end of a marking period comes up, the end of a quarter, there should be no wonder about how a student is doing in a class and what an A, B, C, D, or F means. And that's one of the things I'm going to talk about tonight too, is that, if I use proficiency scales, how do we handle the letter grade scenario? Because in many places where I work, where or providing professional learning, is that we're working on these proficiency scales, yet the state still requires an A, B, C, D, F letter grade. So how do you reconcile that? And I'm going to talk about that as well. And then learning targets are always posted and referred to during the lesson. And one school district that I've worked with, Farmington, New Mexico, when you go into any classroom in that district, you'll see the learning targets up. And not only are the learning targets up, but the kids know what they mean and they refer back to them. And that's a key thing, because a lot of times I'll go into classrooms and I'll see the learning targets that are posted, but the kids don't know what they're working on. They don't know what they mean. So that's a huge one too. And then there's another classroom too, and Kennewick, Washington. And I went into this one teacher's classroom, and the kids evaluate their own work. And they basically have a list of all the skills that they're working on and the associated standards. This is a seventh grade classroom. And the kids are evaluating their own work. And a pink highlighter means I don't have evidence. I haven't started on this skill. Yellow means I'm working on it, and green means I've got it and I can show you evidence. So at a center, kids are evaluating their own work using this checklist of skills and standards. And then when they meet with their teacher, they show the teacher, here's where I've mastered things, here's where I need to still work on them, here's where I haven't even started. And then the teacher and the student can have discussions about where they are and how to improve. Now, the one teacher who does this, it's at Highlands Middle School, in as I said, in Kennewick, Washington, Miss Smith. When I interviewed two seventh grade girls who were doing this, and I always love interviewing middle school students, because when I ask them questions, they always look at me like I'm crazy, right? It's just part of their shtick. And I asked the girls, I said, what's the difference of you sitting down with your work and deciding if it's a pink highlighter, yellow highlighter, or green highlighter? What's the difference than if your teacher collected your papers, graded them, and handed them back? And this one young lady, she kind of looks at me like, well, hey, Dr. McKnight, isn't it obvious? And she looks at me and she says, well, I have a better idea of what I'm doing, why I'm doing it, and how I'm doing it. And when I talk to my teacher, then I have a better idea of what I need to improve. Those are the kinds of conversations that are so extraordinarily rich and important that I know that all of us want to get to. So the learning targets are posted. So not only are they posted like on a bulletin board in the classroom or on the wall, but also kids have an understanding of them. And then students have that greater input and reflection regarding learning target success. And that last example I gave you is a perfect example of that. When kids can reflect on their work and they can see where they are developing that skill and developing that standard, that is such a huge part of developing growth mindset and independence in learning. It's pretty awesome when that starts happening in a classroom. Here's some types of learning targets for you, and I just pulled this from Stiggins. And there's knowledge, reasoning, and skills. So knowledge, and also I'm going to talk about Bloom's taxonomy. Those are kind of basic. So we know facts, we know concepts to be learned. So things like vocabulary, measurement concepts, multiplication tables, U.S. government structures that we have judicial, legislative, and executive branch, things like that. Those are basic knowledge kinds of things. Reasoning are thinking proficiencies. So when I can use knowledge to solve a problem, make a decision, plan, etc. So for instance, in mathematics, if I'm using PEMDAS as a procedure, or I'm using the UPS strategy, which is understand, plan, and solve. Those are protocols, or teaching kids in science, the scientific method. It is a protocol for developing critical thinking, making a plan, making a decision when I am engaging in cognitive tasks and learning. And then skills are those behavioral demonstrations, using knowledge and reasoning to perform skillfully. So when we read fluently, or that we're using laboratory equipment competently, that I can conduct investigations, that I know how to search for information on the internet, and I'm not just using Wikipedia. Those are examples of skills, okay? So those are the types of learning targets. They're either knowledge, reasoning, or skills. Okay, so here we go. So here are some qualities. This is also in the handout section. So if you go over to the handouts, it's marked qualities of effective learning targets. And I adapted this from Stiggins, his book, Classroom Assessment for Learning. And this is actually rooted, sorry, I just realized I had Florida standards on there, but it's tied to anything. So we have the quality. So the learning target is linked to, Florida standards, Texas standards, California standards, whatever your state is using. So the learning target, for instance, if I say I want kids to be able to identify a main idea in a text and find the related details, that would be reading 1 on Common Core. That's standard number 1. And I know that that's also true in Florida and Indiana, and I believe in Texas as well. So that's what it's linked to. And you're going to see how that has an impact on the proficiency scales coming up. That's Act 2 of today's webinar. So moving along. So how are proficiency scales different? Okay, what makes them different? I bet many of you out there use rubrics, are familiar with rubrics. And Marzano writes in his book, Skills-Based Assessment, that one of the biggest differences between rubrics and proficiency scales is this. This is the big difference. Rubrics are more like buckets that I have to fill. So for instance, if I have to have 3 pieces of evidence, that's in the highest level, 2 pieces of evidence is the grade level expectation. I basically filling a bucket, of things that I need to have in order to get a certain letter grade or level of mastery. Proficiency scales are different. Proficiency scales go from basic understanding to a more sophisticated representational demonstration model or level of knowledge. And so it shows the progression in a way that rubrics don't necessarily do. And I'm a big rubric gal. I was using rubrics back in the 90s and the 2000s, but really see the value of proficiency scales. And having been an educator for over 3 decades, we know that our profession is always changing because of everything that we're learning. We're just developing so much information, knowledge about how we learn, and neuroscience has a huge impact on how we teach and how kids learn. So that makes a huge impact. So what we know from proficiency scales is that really does lead to that growth and achievement in a way that rubrics are not necessarily able to do. So let's get into it, okay? This is, you're going to see a quick video. This is my friend Brenna Sherwood. She's out in Farmington, New Mexico, and she's just going to offer from her perspective, what proficiency scales are. And in her district in Farmington, New Mexico, they actually have all of their proficiency scales listed. They're for the public. I think they're one of the best exemplars that is out there right now and available. And make sure you go to Farmington, New Mexico, not Michigan, Farmington, New Mexico Municipal Schools. And it's under curriculum and instruction. And they have all of their proficiency scales. So I'm going to let Brenna kind of explain what proficiency scales do, what they are, what they do, very briefly in about 90 seconds. And then I'm going to come back to you. Okay, so hopefully that's streamed somewhat okay. When I was looking at the what my participants can see on the webinar, it looked like it was a little bit jumpy. So any feedback you have on that would help me because I always want to improve the quality of the webinars. And by the way, we are recording the webinar, so you will receive an email with the link. So if you want to go back and review it or share it and wow and amaze your friends, you're welcome to do that. So there'll be a recorded one as well. So if you want to share that with anybody. But basically, here's an example, okay? So this one is from a science example, and it's grades 6 through 8. And you can see that we have scores, skills broken down. This one has the actual skills, and I'm going to show you how to actually, I'm going to break this down and show you how to actually do it step by step. And then here's some sample tasks too that go along with it. So you can absolutely do that and line up like actual assessments or performance tasks that the kids are doing that correspond with the different skills. Okay, so here's how it breaks down. First, I want to talk to you about Bloom's taxonomy. Whether you use Webb's depth of knowledge or use Marzano's taxonomy or Bloom's taxonomy, I just refer to it all as Bloomzano Webb. Okay, I don't see a whole lot of difference between them. This is Bloom's second version of his taxonomy, and I'm going to use this because I'm a big gal about simplicity. And the thing that I like about Bloom's taxonomy, the second version, is the simplicity of it. Okay, so when we look at this, the bottom two levels with whoops, sorry about that, and come back. are understanding and remembering. Those are the basic kind of simple levels of understanding. And when we go to the proficiency scales, those are largely going to be our simple goals. Like I have to know basic facts, like I have to know scientific method in order to apply that when I am doing my own lab experiment and analyzing my data to determine whether or not my hypothesis was true or not. And that's the evaluation part. So I need those basic understandings, those simple understandings in order to get to the harder stuff. Now here's the trick card, okay? And I get into this when I'm on site and working in professional learning or at conferences and stuff, is that what we tend to do is hang out way too much in the understanding and the remembering. Okay. So if we ask questions, for example, that are in those higher levels of analyzing and evaluating, kids are going to have to learn the understanding and remembering in order to get to that upper part. So I just want to remind ourselves of that, about the questions are really critical. We tend to not ask enough questions that are in that evaluating, analyzing area. And I know as a teacher, as an educator, I've got to write those questions out beforehand. They're not questions that are easy for me to develop in the middle of a class and when I'm working with students, when I'm teaching kids. So the understanding and remembering tends to be more on a simple goal, simple learning target, and the applying, analyzing, evaluating, creating are more complex. And what you're going to notice when you go into your standards, most of the standards, the way that they're written, whether you use Common Core or not, really get into the applying, analyzing, evaluating, and creating. So I'm going to show you what that looks like. Okay. So this is another handout, and it's labeled Proficiency Scale Template. Okay. So in the Proficiency Scale, we have the topic up here. I'm going to show you what that looks like. We have the domain and then the actual topic. 4.0 and 3.0, these are complex goal levels. So on Bloom's taxonomy, that would be applying, analyzing, evaluating, creating. Okay. And then, generally, there are some exceptions to that, but generally that's what it is. And then the simple goals are 2.0 and below. So the simple goals are down here, understanding and remembering. And I want to say developmentally because, what we would consider applying on a second grade level might be a much higher level on the proficiency scale. It depends on how the standard is written for that grade level. So I want to remind everybody about developmentally what that means. So 4.0 is usually above the grade level target as it's articulated in a standard. And then the 3.0 is at grade level. That's the grade level target. And then the below is usually that simple goal. Okay. So here's what it looks like. All right. This is a literary analysis. And actually, Naomi, you might remember this. Naomi did, she's on the webinar tonight. But here's what it looks like. Literary analysis. This is informative. So the first is I know all the simple goals and complex learning goals, and my understanding goes beyond the grade level target. And I'm going to talk about that in a little bit. This is straight from Marzano's work, his language in his book, Skills-Based Grading and Assessment. And so the complex goals, you can see that all of them are pretty much the standards. Oh, let me go back for a second, are the standards. And these are actually aligned with Minnesota state standards. They use Common Core. So these are related to are connected with Common Core. All right. So understand and describe the relationship between text and illustrations. Every single one of these is a learning target from those standards. And then I know all the simple goals plus some of the complex goals. You can see the simple goals are I can identify, I know the vocabulary. So you're going to see identify, but then look back. Whoops, sorry. If you look back here, understand and describe the relationship between text and illustrations. Understand and describe. So describe is getting into a higher level of understanding according to Bloom's taxonomy. Identify similarities and differences. That still is asking for comparison. Even though I can identify those similarities and differences, there is an inference there that I'm also going to make comparison. Identify reasons an author gives to support points in a text. Draft an informative text. So these tend to be higher level. They're more in that application, analyzing, evaluating level. And then the next one, these simple goals, are more on just the pure identification. Do I know it? Do I not know it? So here's another example. I want to show you where these scales are on the Farmington Municipal Schools website, because it's just one of the best ones I've seen out there, and I want to share that with you. So if we go to Farmington Municipal Schools, and this is King Solomon's Mines, my friends. And they leave it open deliberately to share with the community. So there's no hidden secrets about how students are evaluated, okay? So I'm going to Curriculum and Instruction. All right. And then I'm going to go to FMS Curriculum. And here are all the different proficiency scales that they have. So I'm going to pull out a 5th grade one because I've been kind of focusing on middle school. And you can see that all their proficiency scales are listed. So here's one for, let's do reading and writing narrative. Here's their proficiency scale. And up here is the grade level, 5th grade, and this proficiency scale is in quarter 3. So here's the topic proficiency scale. The domain is literary analysis, and then the topic is narrative. And they also make a point too that this is ongoing, and they expect this to have mastery in quarter 4. So kids are starting to work on it. So let me start back here, okay? These are the simple goals. I know all of the simple goals. I know narrative structures, so I can identify what those are. I can identify maps. I can identify figurative language, so I know what personification is. I know what a simile is, what a metaphor is. I can identify specific details. I can identify a theme of a narrative. I can identify characters. And here's the other thing too, the sticky one here with vocabulary. Oops, let me just trying to highlight it without highlighting the whole proficiency scale. Okay, there we go. Okay, so are these the only 2 words that the teachers are using on this proficiency scale? Absolutely not. But these are the you gotta know words. You have to know these words in order to progress, okay? So they say point of view and homograph are the terms, the vocabulary that kids need to learn. So they're not just teaching 2 words in a proficiency scale, and I want to make that clear. These are just the you gottas. You gotta have them, okay? And the expectation is that that they're going to be using this proficiency scale in about 3 weeks. Most of them have cycles of about 3 weeks. And then when we go up here, New Mexico is a Common Core state. So here we see the language. Understand, understand, understand. Compare and contrast, drafting narratives, determining the meaning of figurative language. So that's application and evaluation as well. So we can see that those are on those higher levels of Bloom's taxonomy. And then if you were to look up these within Common Core, this is reading literature 5.6, reading literature 5.2, 5.9. So all of these, every single one of these learning targets is referenced to the standards. And they're constantly going through revisions on these as well. They also have some of the foundational skills down here that they have for the elementary for K5, but then it changes a bit when they get into the older grades. So if you'd like, I can show you another example as well. Let me pull one from mathematics, okay? And so here's mathematics for 5 points. Let's pull expressions in 6th grade. So here's what a math one will look like. So this is, whoops. I don't know how I did that, but I just turned it around. Hang on. Please hold for technical difficulties. Let me just bring it up again. All right. So here we have 6th grade, quarter 3, and the domain is expressions and equations, and then the topic is expressions. So let's go back here, okay? I know all of the simple goals, right? So I can write expressions. I know parts of an expression. And then they have their academic vocabulary, equation, expression, exponent. And those are the 3s you have to have. And then here they have the complex goals. This is the grade level target. and it's correlated, or it's aligned with the Common Core standard. Okay, now let me point something out too. This is a sticky one. I know all of the simple and complex goals, and my understanding goes beyond the grade level target. Sorry, summer cold cough. One of the things that was a challenge for us is that my good friend Richard Cash is an expert in gifted and academically accelerated students. And we don't want to give more work to kids who are gifted and talented and academically accelerated. So we struggled with, what does this exactly mean? I know all of the simple and complex learning goals, and my understanding goes beyond the grade level target. One of the things that's really great about Common Core and other state standards as well, they're all pretty much aligned. Not pretty much, I haven't seen an exception of this, but they're all aligned. They have vertical and horizontal alignment. And what that means is that if this kid is working on expressions in sixth grade and they're already taking on seventh grade mastery of some of the simple and complex goals on the parallel proficiency scale on expressions and equations, that would be a 4.0. That would be going above. So we don't want to give kids more work, but we want to evaluate their work to determine, are they actually working at the next grade level? Are they working at a higher level? And if they are, that's what we really mean. And we've really got into this conversation quite a bit in my work with in Monroe County, Florida, which is the Florida Keys. And we had been working on that as well and talking about what that exactly means while we're developing proficiency scales. And we had a lot of really important conversations about it. So, what is the easy answer? There isn't an easy answer, but what my suggestion is, having done this and working in several school districts and developing these proficiency scales, is that we really need to be cognizant of the fact that we don't want to give more work for students, that we really want to make sure that we're evaluating kids on that higher level. Okay, so kind of going back into closure, this is like the big overview of proficiency scales and learning targets. Remember, learning targets are those goals. Back in the day, we called them objectives, but those are the learning goals. And the learning goals are breakdowns from what we see in a standard. And the proficiency scales are those learning targets as aligned with the standards, the skills that are articulated in the standards, and divided into simple and more complex. Now, if you want to read some more about proficiency scales and such, I do have references in the back. One book that I really suggest, again, is Marzano's book on formative assessment and standards-based grading, and that's available on Solution Tree. Also, Stiggins's book on classroom assessment and student learning, I highly recommend as well. Also, Rick Wormelli just did a revision on his Fair Doesn't Mean Equal. He just has a second edition that came out, and that's in Stenhouse. And I highly recommend that one as well. In addition to that, a lot of colleagues that I work with them on proficiency scales, they keep saying, "Hey, Katie, when are you just gonna, have a book about this, on proficiency scales?" Guess what? I'm working on that, and it's based on the proficiency scales that I've developed in several different school districts for ELA pre-K through 12th grade. And I plan to have that book out in the fall, probably before Thanksgiving. And it'll be proficiency scales, suggested ones, so you have models for all grades, pre-K through 12th grade. So and it's based on the work that I've done in several school districts and with hundreds of teachers, and having those kinds of difficult questions, about, which vocabulary words do we put there and why, and which skills do we emphasize more than others. Those are really critical conversations, and they change, based on your context where you're teaching and the kinds of kids that you have in your school. They're going to change quite a bit based on that. If you have a population with a strong or not strong, a predominant English language population, then a lot of the language standards are going to take on a different kind of emphasis than they might otherwise. So we need to be cognizant of that. So even though I'm going to be providing this, I am going to have an opening that explains how they were developed and what you need to consider. But what I find is that, when we first look at it, a lot of folks get a little, get overwhelmed by it, and justifiably so. It's a huge task. It's a huge undertaking. When I work on proficiency scales in school districts, there are several people that are working on it with me because it's a lot of ground to cover. But the most important thing is that the proficiency scales are never done. You're constantly going to have to go back and revise them. And that's something that Farmington does almost every single summer, every year. They're revising them in some way based on what their experience is as they're using these different tools. So I've given you a lot of information in a short amount of time, in 45 minutes. And as I said, this was really an overview. So I'd be more than happy to take questions down in the chat area. So if you have any questions down there, I'd love to hear from you there. And while you're doing that, writing some of your questions down. I also want to remind you that this is where I'm available. And again, I'm merging these sites, the CatherineMcKnight.com site and Engaging Learners. But of course, you can always find me on at Literacy World. A lot of you folks are Instagrammers. I'm on Instagram at Engaging Learners and also on Facebook at Katie McKnight Literacy. And, again, would you like to develop your students to become more active and independent learners? Proficiency scales are an important vehicle to make that happen. And then do you want to grow your students to develop into the absolute best that they can be? And of course, that's all of us. All of us want that as educators. That's why we went into the profession, right? So, of course, you can always find us at engaginglearners.com. And my team and I, we serve schools all over the United States and internationally. And not only do we work on professional learning and literacy development, but also in that skills-based assessment and developing proficiency scales. And there's lots of professional resources for you that are free at cost at engaginglearners.com. And of course, you can always stay in touch with us on our newsletter. I've got one more webinar coming up in August after I take my family vacation and I start my back to school routine. And that's going to be on Literacy and Learning Centers, a opening overview. So we've got time for questions. So I'd love to hear from you guys. Let me go check out the chat area. Oh, Judy, I see that you asked about the handout. For everybody, I just want to let you know, too, that if you have difficulty with any of the oh, I see a lot of you said you couldn't hear the video. Rats. Okay. You know what? When I send the link, I'll send the link to that video because it's also on YouTube, so you can watch it. So I really apologize for that. That's really important for me to know. A lot of that has to do with streaming. So I'm very happy to take any questions that you might have. Let me see. Mary, I can give you more on grant writing. Just email me at katieengagelearners.com and I can talk to you about grant writing that we do as well. How many of you out there are already already using proficiency scales or started to experiment with them? And I saw your text too, Judy. I saw your thing that you found the handouts. Yay. Okay, so I have one question. It's like, what do you suggest in order to get started? One of the things that I suggest is that, of looking for other proficiency scales, like those ones in Farmington are really great. There's a couple of other resources that I have too, where you can use those proficiency scales, like start experimenting with them. For instance, if I'm going to teach narrative writing and I teach third grade, I might pull a proficiency scale, from that site. And there's a couple of other school district websites that have their proficiency scales public, and start using that and experimenting with it in order to evaluate the students. So I'd probably, take a look at that first and start experimenting with it and start developing it. Okay, here's some more here. Oh, I see Kathy's there too. Hi, Kathy. My buddy from Arizona, where it's like 110 degrees there. Okay, and I see Leslie, you've got a question there. Okay, had a little hiccup there, sorry. Okay, so your charter school uses standards-based reports. Okay, I see that for some reason that's not expanding, Leslie. I'm not quite sure why. All right, hang on one second. Oh yeah, I'll include Sarah. Here's the site. Let me pull that up again for the proficiency scales, so you can go right over there. My buddies in Farmington always kind of laugh at me because they know where I've been when I've been handing it out recently. Here it is, and I will put it down in the chat area, so you have that. There it is. Send to all. There you go. And then yeah, I see folks are putting things in questions rather than chat. It's a little trickier for me to get at those, so it's taking me a little bit longer to get at it. Yeah, yeah. One of the reasons why they publish all of them is again one of the I think the biggest challenges in going to proficiency scales is getting the parents on board, because the parents are in an older paradigm where they got grades all the time, and now we're switching it around. So so in order to get parents on board, that's one of the things that we want to uh, um, make sure that it's public, that we educate the parents about it. So that's one of the reasons why they can't keep it public. But you know, the other thing that I want to add too is in that district, huge growth. I mean, we were seeing double-digit growths and such with the students in that district, and it was a combination of a lot of things. But you know, the fact that expectations were so clearly articulated for the kids, and also that. That it was so clearly articulated, and that they were referred to, and the kids knew what they needed to do to get from simple goal mastery to what am I trying to say? Complex goal mastery was really pretty huge, and I see that over and over and over. That that kids are able to do that. That they are able to um, see what they need to do in order to get to that higher level. So, okay. All right. And then, yeah, Christine, I see your message too about rubrics at the beginning. I will have a recording as well. Yeah, I like to use rubrics as well for projects and such too. Okay. And I see a lot of you told me about the volume, and I know exactly what happened. I didn't see it when I was showing the video. I know exactly what happened. So luckily, it was like a 60-second video. I will share that link with you when I share the recording of the webinar. And if you need a certificate for participation, we do provide an email with the link to the webinar, the recording. So if you need more proof than that for professional development credit, please contact me, and we will be more than happy to do that for you. And give you a certificate, whatever you need in order to prove that you did some professional learning, especially on a summer evening on a Tuesday night. So the next webinar is going to be in August. And since you're on this list for this webinar, we will be sharing that with you as well, and let you know when the sign up for that is going to be. And that webinar will be on literacy and learning centers, grades 4 through 8. I'm sorry, grades 4 through 8, and getting started with those. So, hey, I want to thank all of you for coming. And if there's any questions that you have, if I didn't answer your question or you need information, please, 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 please contact me. I'm more than happy to help out in any way that I can. And thank you very much for all that you do on behalf of students. I want you to know that I personally appreciate you more than just Teacher Appreciation Day or week. I appreciate you every day. So on that note, I hope you all find something fun to do this summer, and I will hopefully see you on the next webinar. Thanks so much for joining me. Bye-bye.